Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and in this one I'm going to go over my round 6 game from the Luneberg Chess Festival. Now, if you followed the round 5 video, you know that I drew my game against a Grandmaster from India, and I really had great winning chances throughout, but was really never able to really seal the deal, and it was just a sign of the inconsistency and the slippage I was showing all over the place in this tournament. So I was trying to sort of mend the fences in this one and play a little bit better. My opponent in this one was an international master from Germany by the name of Jakob Pajeken. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but an international master from Germany born in the year 2003, so relatively young, being 16 years old. And again, I think I've said this before, but you'll notice that that's actually a trend when I'm playing in a lot of these tournaments, especially in various closed events, that I actually am one of the older players these days. And you might say, oh, 26, you're not that old, but actually I'm kind of like, or at least it feels to be the case, that I'm oftentimes a dinosaur in some of these events, relatively speaking, because there are people pretty much 10 years younger than me now that are competing and coming up and so on. And most of my peers, most of them actually kind of left the game by now. So it is what it is. Anyways, I was black in this one, and I didn't really know what to expect. He played a lot of different stuff, but without further ado, let's get into it. So Jakob opened with d4, and I went knight f6, and after knight f3, I went e6. A little bit unusual move order from me. I just wasn't quite sure what he was opting for, and I thought, I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to surprise with the King's Indian or play e6 and go back to normal lines. So I just wanted to think a little bit after knight f6, because my traditional response after d4 is just to go d5 on move 1. So anyways, after e6, bishop f4 was played, and all of a sudden we actually have a London system, and this is something that I know quite decently. I've had, experience on both sides of the setup with white and black, and some of my greatest memories as a chess player have been on the black side of the system, because to secure my first Grandmaster norm in 2018, I actually needed a win with black in the final round against an international master that was about 2450, and I actually was on the black side of a London system and won that game quite convincingly. And since then, I've actually employed a similar system for the most part against the London, and actually wound up doing the same here. So after bishop f4, I went d5. And then after e3, which is typically played, these are typically the first 4 moves in the London system. Maybe you can trade out the knight on f3 for pawn c3, but typically establishing this triangle of pawns and putting the bishop on f4 is sort of the modus operandi in the system. And the idea for black here, and the one that I've basically employed on several occasions, is the move bishop d6. Now, this idea, I believe, came to prominence through Magnus Carlsen and some rapid games that he played in, I want to say 2017, maybe 2018, but basically that was who I first saw it from. It probably was employed by players that were not as strong as Magnus previously, but really when Magnus, plays something, it tends to be quite a serious move, or something that should be seriously looked at. I believe Anish Giri once said, when Magnus plays something, it needs to be checked. And so the idea with bishop d6 is actually that you can test the bishop on f4, and in particular the e5 square, because in the London system, white's typically trying to use the e5 square as a wedge to facilitate an attack on the king side. And so by putting the bishop on d6, black's actually fighting for that square right away, as opposed to typically where, typically black just has to deal with the e5 square because white's just controlling it, and the bishop normally goes to e7. So the idea is just to challenge this bishop right away. My opponent played c3 here, which is actually kind of the latest trend in this line. It's actually to ignore the tension on f4, and this at least told me that he actually had some decent understanding of the setup, because 95% of players actually go bishop g3. And while this isn't a mistake or anything, Magnus Carlsen has even played this with white himself in some rapid games. The point is that when white castles, bishop takes on g3 becomes very attractive. And the reason for that is because the pawn structure, even though quite solid with g3, g2, and f2, it's quite compact, but it's actually difficult to mobilize the pawns. And in many lines, there's circumstances where the knight can come to g4, and then there's actually some mating ideas, some back rank mating ideas with rook d1. So for instance, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here, let's say bishop g3, let's say castles, bishop d3, b6, c3, c5, knight bd2, actually bishop b7, castles. Now, actually, after bishop takes g3, h takes g3, even though white's position is quite solid here, this pawn structure is actually not so mobile. And if black is able to get control of the e5 square, with the knight on d7 and queen on c7, what winds up happening is black can very quickly seize the initiative. And again, the structure is a little bit sensitive in the endgame. There's some circumstances where this knight comes to g4, and then black can deliver mate on h2 sometimes, or again get a back rank mate if the rook somehow got to e1. And again, when the knight comes to g4, you can't really dislodge it because f3 typically hangs the e3 pawn. So again, I know it's a little bit long-winded, but that's basically one of the hidden secrets of the structure. And part of the reason why bishop g3 kind of is not the most challenging try, I'd say, or at least the most principled, because black will just wait on taking the bishop until white has clarified the position of his king. And so basically, c3 is like the latest fashion. It actually was employed recently in the London, not the London Chess Classic. I want to say what tournament? It was played in the Tata Steel Rapid and Blitz that took place in India, where basically now they're playing for the structure where they actually take on f4, and basically white argues that these double pawns aren't so big a problem because the knight comes to e5. Of course, the f pawn gives white greater control of the e5 square. And then whenever black tries to break with c5, white is actually quite comfortable taking on c5 and giving the d4 outpost to the knight. And then this knight on b1 swings around to e5. And white tends to have really good dark square control. Although black is not in serious danger, it's just a slightly easier position to play for white. So yeah, so after c3, I actually just castled, keeping the tension. I'd actually played a game with, not with e5, with bishop takes f4, e takes f4, and c5 at some point. And my opponent, this was in 2017, before I did the whole road to Grandmaster stuff. But after d takes c5, queen c7, I did recover my pawn. I think I recovered the c5 pawn because my opponent played g3. But it was a little bit annoying because, again, white's knight's got this dark square control. So not, the easiest position in the world to play. So anyways, here I decided to castle and not go for c5 right away. And now knight bd2 was played, so my opponent's keeping the tension. And now I actually went c5 here. And part of the reason c5 is a little bit better here than in previous circumstances is because at least in this variation, I haven't taken on f4. So, basically, he doesn't have total dark square control, and he doesn't have a grip on the e5 square if he takes on c5. And, okay, this position is obviously playable for white, but I can at least fight for the e5 square, maybe with knight c6 and rook e8, among other moves, maybe even queen e7, and it's not so bad. Another option is actually to play b6 right away, just to not allow dc5, bishop takes c5, and to always ensure that you recapture with the b pawn. But anyways, after c5, white played bishop d3. This is normal. Normally, people don't really want to relinquish the triangle of pawns or that tension in the center with the triangle of pawns, because when you do take on c5, there's less of a bind in the center. And if the center isn't like kind of closed, or, if that bind of the triangle of pawns isn't really there, it's very unlikely that white can actually get off a kingside attack because he wouldn't have the e5 square to anchor his pieces. So that's why the d pawn stayed on d4. And after bishop d3, I actually now went knight c6. This move I'm I kind of came to regret. It's not something that I've played before in this structure. The idea typically with the bishop d6 plan is to go queen c7 and knight bd7. And the idea there with queen c7 and knight bd7 is that the knight can recapture on c5 if black releases the tension. And I also challenge the bishop on f4. And I would come to regret this, and we'll see a little bit why. I'll come to regret knight c6 because c5 is a little bit less secure than I would like. Now, again, in this position, queen c7 is an option, b6 is also an option, and even bishop takes f4 is an option, just transposing back to some of those lines I was talking about before. And I can even take on f4 and now go b6, and then try to get rid of this light squared bishop with bishop a6. This is actually typical protocol in this structure. Although here I should say white can go queen e2. So perhaps the most proper move order, if I really do want to get rid of the bishop on f1, or that comes to d3 right away, is I should probably start with b6, just so that after bishop d3 comes, I can meet it with bishop a6 right away. And then these bishops get traded off. My knight's a little bit misplaced, and white normally goes queen e2, and then black normally goes back to b8, and then reroutes that knight and prepares for c5. So this is actually probably a little bit more precise than what I did, or what is possible in the position, but it is what it is. So anyways, after c5, bishop d3, knight c6, white now went bishop g3, and this is actually a really good move. And it's a little bit strange because in the previous setups I was saying that bishop g3 retreating is a mistake. But essentially this position actually with the knight on c6 transposes to another critical acid test of the London system, and basically basically it's more legitimate now because I'm not actually threatening to totally control the e5 square. Basically, with the knight on d7, I'm actually protecting c5, going queen d7 and playing e5, and that's actually the issue. But with the knight on c6, it's not quite the same thing because after bishop g3, now I went h6, but the point is that if I go queen c7, I have this issue now with d takes c5. And this is why the knight on c6 is actually slightly inaccurate, because now you can see that I can't recapture on c5 because my queen is en prise. And obviously taking on g3 is not desirable because white hasn't castled yet. And that means that after h takes g3, there's an initiative on the h file that's a little annoying to contend with. Now, in these structures, white isn't winning or anything. I mean, I could go h6 here, but the point that, basically this c5 pawn hasn't been secured and there's a little bit of pressure on the h file makes this quite uncomfortable to play from a practical perspective. And again, this is why the knight c6 move is a mistake, because again, this bishop d6 move comes in conjunction with queen c7 and knight bd7, and now I can actually get that set up. So after knight c6, bishop g3, I pretty much have to go in a different direction, and I decided to go h6. And the reason I did that is because I really want to take on g3, but I didn't think I should do that before I played h6. So just one sample variation, if I take on g3 right away without queen c7, well, after h takes g3, let's say I go h6 now knight e5 is actually quite annoying because, again, I don't have the coverage of the e5 squared that I normally would like in the d6 lines. And now white can reinforce this knight on e5 with f4 if I, play a move like queen d6. Like f4 is a possibility. And that's quite unpleasant. So even actually knight df3 is also a possibility, although I have my reservations about whether it makes sense for white to relinquish control of the e4 square, because my knight might jump into e4. And then there's also nasty ideas of g4 and g5 kind of prying open the h file because I've created a hook with the h6 move. So this is the type of thing that, you really don't want to face in these type of systems as black against the London, and that's why I went h6. After h6, my opponent went queen e2, and this is actually a very, very good move, and a really, really good waiting move that just keeps the tension in the position. Typically, in these structures, white can play a few more moves before castling to kind of invite bishop takes g3, h takes g3, and that structure again, and this is one of those moves. Another one is actually rook d1 to actually line up the rook against the queen on d8, and it seems like there's a lot of pieces on the d file, but it's remarkably Well, it's quite remarkable how quickly the d file can clear, because there can basically be like bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, or d takes e5, and then e4, then knight takes e4, and all of a sudden there's some bishop h7 check splat, uncovering the rook that's on d1 to the queen on d8. So again, it seems kind of far-fetched, but it's remarkable how quickly things can open up, because queen e2 also supports a potential e4 lever at the right moment. And e4 is always a little bit annoying to face because it threatens a fork with e5, forking my knight and bishop. So, good waiting move. I now went rook e8, trying to kind of force through this e5 move. But, yeah, in hindsight, this is probably not very precise, because if I don't get an e5, the rook on e8 is really not very sensible. Instead, b6 was a little bit more consistent with, development and just getting my bishop out, and probably a better try. The reason I was a little bit concerned about b6 was lines with e4 coming on the board. And again, e5 is a problem fork. And there is a little bit of a trap here where if I take on e4 multiple times, this actually works out horribly for me, because there's a mate on h7 and the knight on c6 is hanging. So I actually just lose a piece. And so I can't take multiple times, and I have to be a little bit careful here because of the e5 fork. So the key thing here is actually I can play bishop takes g3. And after h takes g3, and now I can go c takes d4. And this is actually quite an important difference, because now I've managed to trade these bishops before e5 comes as a fork. And I think if e5 here, I think I might have the intermediate move d takes c3, which enables me to actually win a pawn, because the knight on d2 is actually hanging. And obviously if this recapture, now my knight moves, and there's no immediate mate threat that I can see, and obviously the pawn structure here is mangled in the center, and so black should be better here after going knight c5 and getting rid of this bishop on d3. If the bishop winds up going back, then there's bishop a6 hitting the queen on e2, and black starts to take over. So I think that was actually more prudent to take on g3 and then go, and then basically e4 is not really a huge problem. So b6 is a little bit more precise. Now after rook e8, white actually went knight e5, and again you could see here that what's the point of rook e8 if e5 doesn't get in the game? And now the other problem I have is I can't go with b6 anymore, because the knight on c6 is actually hanging. And so rook e8 is actually a huge strategic error, just because it gives white the needed time to build up his initiative in the center and on the king side. Now, I would love to develop my pieces with b6, bishop b7. I can't do that. I also would love to take on e5, but that's very ill-advisable. Obviously, if I take on e5 with the knight, that's a fork. But if I take on e5 with the bishop, not only do I forfeit the bishop pair, but after knight d7, f4 is actually quite annoying. And this dark square bind is something that gives white the advantage. So it's just not very advisable here. And because of that, I need to find some new way to develop and challenge the white knight on e5. And I went for the move queen c7. Now, queen c7, again, is kind of, the plan with this bishop d6 setup. But if you look at the other moves I've made, they're not consistent with it. So the knight on c6 sticks out a bit like a sore thumb. It should be on d7. The rook on e8 sticks out because it, isn't doing anything on the e-file. And even the pawn on h6 is, it's kind of okay, but at the end of the day, I'm actually creating a little bit of a hook on the king side, and it just was kind of a waste of time. And so all those factors, those three moves in particular that I'm highlighting, really gave white added time to build up his initiative, and this is why this is not an ideal setup for me. Now, I am challenging this knight on e5, so white has to do something about it. And he actually played the move knight takes c6, which is a quite effective one. The issue for me pretty much immediately is that I can't take with the queen because bishop b5 is actually a skewer. And we can see right away that, again, this rook on e8 did not make sense here. So after knight c6, I have to really figure out what to do. I played the move bishop takes g3, and I thought this was a little bit more precise because what I realized is that if I play b takes c6, then after d takes c5, Obviously, I can't take on c5 because the queen is hanging, so I would wind up having to take anyway. So I thought it was just more precise to take on g3 right away. And after bishop takes g3, h takes g3, the h file is opened. Now, I did play h6, so there's no impending mating attack here because there's no bishop h7 check. But after the move b takes c6, the position is really not ideal because my bishop still on c8 is not going to get in the game very quickly because the pawn on c6 is in the way of the typical diagonal it would develop to. And obviously I can't go bishop a6 because the white queen and bishop have set up this battery on this diagonal already. So, and then to add insult to injury, white can just play d takes c5, and this is actually just what white did, which is actually really effective. Note that if you play a move like knight f3, trying to fight more over the e5 square, I can actually play c takes d4, and then after c takes d4, go c5. And, this is actually decent for me, I think, because I liberate my backward pawn, and I also would have a central pawn majority, and so I think black's play would be quite nice from here. White would still have the e5 square for the moment, but, if you stick this knight on e5, I can choose to take on d4, or I can even play c4, and I just think that, black has a good counterplay on the queen side, and I can always consider challenging this knight with something like knight d7. The other thing is I could consider taking on d4 and going queen b6, and then there's problems with the d4 pawn already because if that pawn drops, the knight really does not have a good anchor. Not to mention the fact there's also queen a5 check in this position, challenging the queen here. And yeah, maybe queen trades actually aren't good for me because now the knight is actually quite secure and the rooks get connected. But I'm just pointing it out as an option. So basically, d takes e5 was pretty good. After d takes e5, the issue here is that, yeah, I do basically have a safer king for the moment because I'm castled, but I'm a pawn down and I really have to justify the lack of material. And really the issue for me that I kind of realized here is that it's quite difficult for me to actually, pick up that pawn in some way because white has two reasonable ways to defend it with b4 and knight b3. And basically, I really lack coverage on the dark squares. You can see the c5 pawn, is a real wedge in my setup. And if b4 comes on the board, this is also a major wedge on the queen side. So basically, there's this bind happening that's really annoying to contend with. And it just makes me have to justify my position, my compensation right away, which is pretty difficult to contend with. So after d takes e5, I actually took a long think. And this is actually quite rare for me to take a seriously long think because it means I get down on time. And this actually does not bode well for me in a lot of games because if you're down on time, then, you have to make decisions under the gun, and it's, very difficult to do that. So after d takes e5, I actually played e5, basically trying to seize some initiative in the center, play, with the control of the middle. But I knew full well going for the setup that it was quite unlikely that I would, comfortably, recover my pawn, and I really had to play with energy here. After e5, my opponent played e4, and I think this is actually a pretty good decision because if you decide to castle here, it is possible I could generate some decent attacking play with the move e4, and even something like as brute forces rook e5 and rook h5 could be quite dangerous. Also, bishop g4 is actually pretty annoying as well, just challenging the queen on e2. And obviously, a move like f3 I would be thrilled to see because I can take on f3 and then my queen can come into g3 with decisive effect. Another option here is actually knight g4. The same idea that f3 is not really a great move because g3 is hanging and my knight and rook would converge on e3. But if you don't do anything, I have an idea of going queen e5, queen h5, and queen h2 checkmate. And so playing e4 so I don't actually take all the space in the middle is quite a decent move. And it's actually really reminiscent of positions in the semi-Slav where, white tends... Typically, it's black that has the structure, but white is almost playing the black version of a semi-Slav because he's breaking on e4 when I played e5 and can actually reinforce on the queen side with the move b4. So it did remind me a little bit of a semi-Slav type of position. After e4, I played the move queen a5, trying to now, pick off the c5 pawn, but this is probably a step in the wrong direction because it's not consistent with the energy I need to play to justify my compensation. Instead, bishop g4 was a little bit better, and this is a move that I think is, quite, like, the idea is quite difficult sometimes for humans to actually play, because the point is that after f3, the bishop actually doesn't get to stay there, but actually just darts back to e6. And the idea is that forcing this f3 move actually created a weakness along the g1 to a7 diagonal, and also made the g3 pawn just a touch more sensitive than it was a move ago. So there are circumstances where later in the game, maybe a move like knight h5 is quite effective, trying to land on one of these critical dark squares, maybe even win the g3 pawn, and this might give me adequate play. Now, after castles, knight h5 right away might be a little bit too eager, but I could start with a5, try to corral this b4 break a little bit, and really just play, a little bit more of a controlled game where I am going to be down a pawn, but I have some trumps. I've managed to, have decent control in the center. I have some type of control on the queen side. B4 can still be played, but I might be able to take on b4 and go rook a3 and maybe get some initiative on the queen side. And it is kind of difficult for white to completely mobilize the queen side pawns. So basically, instead, I went queen a5, and now white actually went b4. And I think this is basically the issue with the queen a5 move, is that if I'm now recovering the c5 pawn, and now my queen needs to go on an escapade to justify the setup. And so after b4, I played the move queen a3. Of course, if I go back, let's say queen c7, now a3 can be played, and now white is completely reinforced and basically consolidated the queen side, so I have no way of challenging here. And even a move like a5 could kind of accelerate my collapse on the queen side, because once white castles, the rooks are connected, so a takes b4 isn't a threat, and white may entertain a move like knight b3, challenging the a5 pawn and forcing me to make an important decision to basically open up the a file, or even close the position with a4 when my pawn would be a future target. So yeah, I think basically I had no choice but to keep going with queen a3, but I felt quite uncomfortable doing this. White now castled, and I think this is another move, frankly, that I kind of just overlooked. I thought that white would try to defend this pawn in some way, which seems nonsensical now because there's no real way to do it. But I think I just underestimated that castles was actually quite a decent move, and that now my hand is kind of in the proverbial cookie jar, because I kind of need to justify this escapade, and I took on c3. But now my queen is in enemy lines, my rooks aren't connected, and my bishop is not developed, and white has a pretty dangerous queenside pawn structure, even with the c3 pawn gone. So basically, my queen is very, very insecure here, and you could see that, obviously I can't come back because a6 and a5 are both covered. So I pretty much am stuck out on c3 and kind of have to hope for the best. White now played a3, which is a really good move, just shoring up the queen side here. And I have to be very careful because, again, my queen on c3 really only has a few squares in this position to move to, and I'm kind of caught in that cookie jar. I played the move bishop g4 now, trying to challenge the queen on e2 before my queen got trapped. And this is actually a decent move because now white needs to play f3, and this was basically what the computer was suggesting before, trying to, basically provoke this f3 move. And now I also, with f3, allow myself this queen d4 move with check. So that was actually kind of a nice thing. But after f3, I went bishop e6 back, and my queen is still a little bit precarious here, so I have to be quite careful. White now went rook fc1, challenging this queen on c3, and I thought I was pretty much obliged to play queen b2 because I thought that it was very important that I actually save the d4 square, hold it in reserve, because if I go there right away with queen d4 check, I thought that there was a circumstance where after the king moves, let's say to h2, knight b3 actually threatens to trap my queen. So I thought I wanted to keep queen b2 because it just pins the knight to the queen on e2 for the moment, and just gives me still the other option to go queen d4 at a later juncture. White now went e takes d5, and I now went queen d4 check because I thought now it was very important to get my queen back in the game. And one of the things that I was a little bit concerned about now is that if basically if I recapture with the pawn, this is extremely risky because the c pawn is protected and pass, and I think these queenside pawns are actually more dangerous than my central pawns. And the other nuance is that if I take with a piece, I thought knight c4 was quite annoying because now my queen is challenged, and this knight has a very, very annoying outpost on d6 because of the pawn on c5. And of course, I don't really want to play bishop takes c4 in a lot of positions, let's say in this type of position, because this bishop is super, super strong eyeing the f7 square. It's on a great diagonal, and my remaining pawn on the queen side, or one of my remaining pawns, c6, is a fixed weakness on a light square, so it could be a potential target to bishop a6 and bishop b7, or something along those lines a bit later. So I went queen d4 check after e takes d5. And here, after king h2, I went bishop takes d5, which is extremely important, I thought, because I'm actually just stopping knight b3, which would trap my queen. White played rook d1 now, lining the queen up against d4. And it's kind of funny because I mentioned this as a possibility in the opening, and now it's happening in the middle game where my queen is caught out on the d file. And it appears that there are multiple pieces on this line that are in the way of the rook and the queen, but it's actually quite easy for these pieces to move away and for there to be really dangerous tactical threats. Just to give you an example, if I make a nothing move like rook b8, now the knight can move somewhere, let's say knight c4, and already bishop h7 check is a really, really nasty threat, just winning the queen on d4. So I have to be very, very careful here. And unfortunately here, I actually took a step in the wrong direction, and my position basically became lost. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out what you would do in this position to hold the game. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to figure out what the right move was in this position. The best move in this position is actually the move e4. And it's actually quite logical and even looks like the right move to try and break in the middle. And honestly, I just was not myself really in this game or this tournament because I just kept missing, just clear and obvious moves. And the point is that I, first of all, give my queen an escape square, but also I'm actually trading material, which is actually fine. So basically, if knight takes e4, now I can go knight takes, and the key thing is that after bishop takes e4, hitting my queen, I actually can just go queen e5. And the point is, even though I'm temporarily a pawn down, I'm actually threatening to recapture on e4 now that my queen is not, being harassed. And actually in this position, I'm actually threatening to win a piece because if you go, let's say if you make a bad move like rook c1, now there's actually queen h5, check. And after the king moves, I have even a move like rook takes e4. And the point is that fe4 is not possible because the queen on e2 is hanging. So all of a sudden, I'm actually threatening to win a piece. And this is actually quite an important detail and feature in the position that gives me, good counterplay. White now would need to play rook e1 to reinforce the bishop on e4. And now I can still go queen h5 check anyway. And then after king g1, take on e4. And even though I'm temporarily a pawn down still here, now I can play the move queen e5. And even though white has this nice queenside pawn majority, 3 versus 2, the issue is that white's king is too naked, and I have too much counterplay on the g3 pawn, on the e4 pawn. My rook on a8 can come to d8. And quite frankly, my queen on e5 is too centralized for me to have any problems here. So black would be completely fine. So that was the move, e4, exchanging on e4, and then playing queen e5. Very, very important. Instead, I was wary of these discoveries with bishop h7, and I played the move king f8. But frankly, this is just too slow, because now white played the move knight e4, and my queen is just caught out. It just it's just trapped here. My queen has no squares on c3, c4, b2. The white queen now covers my squares on the queen side, and then the knight and bishop also cover squares. And I'm just collapsing here because now the bishop moves and I just will lose material. I played bishop b3, trying to at least hit the rook on d1, but now bishop a6 is played, and even here, with my bishop hitting the rook on d1, I'm still losing material. And this is actually another move that I just missed. I thought that bishop c2 would be played, and then at least I have queen b2, and this pin ensures that I'm not losing material. But bishop a6 is actually still accentuating the fact that my queen is trapped. And sure, I can get an exchange for it initially, but this just won't get the job done. And so I went knight takes bishop takes d1, rook takes d1, then knight takes e4, because what else? My queen is still trapped here. And after rook takes d4, I went knight c3, which at least gives me a position where I have two rooks for the queen, because now the queen has to move, and then I can play e takes d4. But the issue is that after queen takes d4, even though I'm just a pawn down, the position is completely lost because of the nature of the queenside pawns. Basically, they're both isolated and weak because they're split, and my pieces simply aren't well coordinated enough to really defend this at all. And the other issue is that my knight on c3 doesn't really have a great anchor right now, because even if it comes back to d5, it won't be a permanent anchor because it can be undermined with bishop b7 or even b5. So I went knight d5 back because what else? If I move my knight anywhere else, there's queen d6 check and taking on c6. But after knight d5, bishop b7 is played, and now you can see the rook on a8 and the pawn on c6 is skewered. I went rook a d8, and now white took on c6 anyway, which is actually quite effective. There's no useful discoveries for my knight. Note that a move like knight e7 actually doesn't work because queen e4 holds together the bishop, and obviously knight takes b4, the queen just recaptures on b4. So there's really no great discovery here. I knew full well I was losing here, and I just, it is what it is. So I went knight f6. I tried my last-ditch effort to try and get counterplay on the second rank before white pushes his queenside pawns. But unfortunately, this was not going to change the result. White played queen c3. I played rook e2. White went bishop b5, which is a good move, challenging my rook on e2 with tempo, giving him time to push the c-pawn. I went rook f2 because, again, I'm just trying my last-ditch hope of getting counterplay on the second rank. But now c6 is just coming. And I went rook d2, and now white played c7. And frankly, it's not even difficult to calculate. I mean, all you have to see is that if I take with check, can I keep checking forever? Is it perpetual? And the answer is no. So actually, after the move c7, I resigned. But just to give you a sense of why that's the case, if I take on g2, obviously you don't go to h3 because that would be rook h2 and mate. So definitely not go to h3. But you just go back to h1, and I basically have to keep checking or, white queens. And so the only check I have that doesn't lose material right away is rook h2. But after king g1, rook g2, king f1, the king actually can migrate towards the center, because after rook f2 check, king e1, I run out of checks because the bishop is, oops, that's a bad diagonal. The bishop is actually controlling the important squares on near the king on f1 and e2, and so I have no more checks. So basically, instead of making him play out those checks, we both understood this mission was lost, and I'd had enough of another bad day at the office, so I resigned. Really, really disappointing game for me, because quite frankly, I know these London system setups really well. So to have made those errors in the opening, those errors in judgment, was really disappointing because I know better. I really do know better than to put my knight on c6 and the bishop d6 setup. I know better than to play a move like rook e8, just inviting knight e5. And I basically gave white three tempos in a position that you really shouldn't do that. But even there, I got chances in the middle game to equalize the game. I Obviously, this e4 move was an important one. And, these are things I would see typically, but I just was missing so many details. So just a bad day at the office. And, that was just the theme in this tournament. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.